thanks, Alberto, for that introduction, but actually there are a lot of other people I need to thank for the presentation that I'm about to give. So other colleagues from UEA, I mean, including Alberto, but also Steve Dorling, who I think is online, might be able to help out with questions. Nicholas Vasilakos, also from UEA, but also all the SECLI firm case study teams. So, well, Alberto kind of abbreviates things as co-co-co, but I guess one overarching term is co-production. So I think it's useful to start with a definition of co-production in the context of climate services. And of course, there are many, but this is one that some of us put together in a paper a couple of years ago. And I would say that each word here actually involved a lot of thought and consideration and effort on behalf of the whole SECLI firm team. So co-production is clearly a collaborative process between the scientists and the decision makers, or between the providers and the users, if you like. But it's also sustained, as you'll hear, in our case, over the entire length of the SECLI firm project. And the aim is to produce ultimately useful, actionable, and socially robust knowledge. Okay, and Alberto stressed the importance of engagement as being at the heart of SECLI firm. So this graphic comes from a paper on climate services by Chris Hewitt, and kind of shows three different levels of engagement, from fairly basic, I would say, just kind of passing up or down information provision, through to much stronger sort of dialogues. Actually, co-production comes in the middle orange tier, but in SECLI firm, what we were aiming for was the top level of tailored and targeted engagement, so very active with focused relationships, focusing on the development of bespoke services, very iterative, often with one-to-one contact. And hopefully by the end of our conference, you'll agree that we were successful in attaining this level. So how do we do this? Well, as you know, we were focusing on seasonal forecasting, but also on decision-making processes and very specific decision-making, with the ultimate aim and hope that the seasonal forecast information will allow users to make better and earlier decisions. Better could mean saving money, for example. And as we've heard, that was done with 9 very targeted case studies, focusing on the renewable energy and to some extent the water sectors. So here are the 9 case studies. But the point I want to stress here is that I really think that these case studies were co-designed, by which I mean that they were actually identified at a very early stage. Actually, they were all identified within the original proposal. And within the proposal, we already had on board the sort of pairings of industrial and research partners, which lie at the heart of each of the case studies. So, for example, for case study 6, one of the offshore case studies, a partnership between the Dutch Meteorological Service and TenneT as the industrial partner, the Met Office partnering with National Grid and Thames Water, for example. So as I say, these, in my mind, this was true co-design and co-development, because there were kind of discussions and iterative engagement, interaction with the industrial and research partners throughout the project. I would say most of the discussions between the industrial and research partners happened on a one-to-one basis, which allowed the development of good relationships of trust and understanding. Next slide, please. And this is just one example of, at times, how intense these kind of relationships were, the amount of effort that went in on both sides. And what this is showing, it's an example from one of our case studies, in this case involving the Met Office and Thames Water, and a timeline of just 6 or 7 months during the final stages of developing a trial climate service. And you can see the kind of level of interaction and engagement that was happening with kind of results, outputs being presented to the stakeholders with discussion, the trial forecast being signed off by the industrial partner. Then the trial forecast service in this case was being disseminated to Thames Water twice a week, and regular meetings with Thames Water to review the service, to talk about things like the effectiveness of the visualization tool, which led to some kind of changes and developments. And then in this case, there was also some discussion with some of the related case studies where there was good crossover between case studies. So this is really, I think, a good example of the kind of intensity and the depth of the some of the relationships. Next slide, please. But our industrial partners did also join some of the SECLI firm workshops. And one of the things that we did in one of our earlier workshops in Milan was to kind of embark on this process of developing decision trees. And we actually started it as or just to see how it would go, to see if it would be a useful tool, working actually with the Shell and the Tenet case studies. And this was very much an interactive workshop session with the industrial partners. Here, John from Shell sort of being interrogated, asked questions about the decision-making process, in this case relating to the hire of offshore vessels for maintenance. And Laurent Debout here scribing. And this is what we ended up with at the end of the workshop. And you'll see this in a more formal context presented tomorrow in the session on the offshore case studies. But as Alberto said, after having had this first go and seeing what the utility of the decision trees might be, it was agreed that there was utility in having them for all of the case studies. So on the left-hand side is an example of the decision tree that Alberto already showed, and you'll hear more about tomorrow. So this was the decision tree developed by Enel and used in a number of the case studies that they were involved with. So I don't want to go into the details of the decision tree now, but just to say a little bit about how we use decision trees as a tool within each of the case studies. So as a tool to provide visualization of key decisions, and I would say focusing on the climate-driven ones, but not the only consideration for our industrial partners, and to provide a systematic and a consistent way of doing this. Then to identify the points and the nodes where improved climate information and seasonal forecasts can be input. In this case, this is the top row here, but also to see where and how the value of using the information could be assessed. So here, using these performance indicators and these outcomes at the bottom here. And they also helped us to address how to embed probabilistic information, so probabilistic forecasts, within current decision-making processes, where sometimes people were using deterministic information. And next slide, please. So I think perhaps one of the greatest utilities of the decision trees was to provoke useful conversations and in-depth conversations, and eventually sharing of critical information. And I would say sometimes confidential information, so we can't make all of the decision trees that were developed publicly available. But I think they were a really valuable tool. And one of the things they helped us with is this issue of identifying user needs, which are often seen as the first chain in developing climate services. And this little cartoon here is a graphic developed for one of our work packages, and showing on one side this question, what does industry need from climate data? And on the second side, how can seasonal forecasts be embedded in risk management decisions? But I think what we really learned from SECLI firm is that you can't separate these two sides. You can't separate an understanding of the needs from the decisions. And the needs certainly evolve and develop as these conversations happen, as information is shared on both sides. And although we developed lists of climate variables at quite an early stage of SECLI firm, I would say that generally what was ultimately delivered for our users was something kind of quite different. And so just to iterate that identifying needs is not a one-way or a linear process, and indeed it's not a fast process. It takes time. So next slide, please. Okay, so I've talked a bit about co-design, co-development of the case studies. So now let's move on to co-evaluation. And when one's thinking about climate services and how to evaluate them, there's a number of different things one can evaluate. Perhaps the most obvious thing to do is to evaluate the outputs and the outcomes. So by the outputs, that would be the products, in this case, a seasonal forecast that have been provided, and the outcomes would be the sort of influence on the user. And I would say it's kind of here that SECLI firm focused, so thinking about the quality of the outputs and thinking about the outcomes in terms of their economic and or practical value. Also thinking a little bit about are the outputs and the outcomes better because of this intensive engagement and co-production. But just to note that there are other things that could be evaluated, particularly if we brought in sort of more social science expertise. So we could have evaluated the actual process of co-production, the quality and effectiveness of the stakeholder engagement, and also the extent to which SECLI firm has developed and helped to sustain communities of practice. But in terms of this economic or practical value of the SECLI firm information and trial climate services, we took this sort of two-stream experimental approach shown rather simplistically here, but with the idea of you look at how users currently make their decisions. And I would say that for SECLI firm, in all cases, I think the climate information that was being used was what we call climatology, so typically long-term averages for climate variables. And so the experimental strategy was to compare the outcomes of the decisions using this climatology information compared with the outcomes of the decisions using the tailored climate forecasts. So here I'm showing again the list of potential methods for economic valuation assessment of climate services. These are all described in a literature review that's in a public SECLI firm deliverable, so you can go and read up about these kind of different methods. So this review was done at a fairly early stage in SECLI firm by an economic expert working at UEA. And then there was a lot of discussion involving the case studies, or Nicholas, our economic expert, trying to decide which method was most appropriate for which particular case study, with the choice of models being influenced by a number of different factors, some of which I would say are probably quite kind of technical in terms of the economics in whether or not the decision maker or the decision has an influence outside the user's institution or not. But I would say that probably the greatest constraint and the greatest limitation was probably data availability. So economic data availability, the availability of appropriate and non-confidential information data, particularly for the econometric models. But then the next slide shows the outcome. In the table on the left-hand side of the valuation approaches and the metrics and data that we use for each of the case studies. So the 5 NL case studies are shown together here. So they used econometric modeling with some of their in-house models relating to hedging strategy to address market risks and weather exposure. A number of the case studies used avoided costs and cost loss models. In other cases, things were kind of more qualitative. But I would say that there were kind of 2 groups of quantitative economic valuation methods that were used in the case studies. So one was performance indicators that were used by NL, and you'll hear about the application of this approach to one of the case studies from Marco and colleagues tomorrow. And the other is relative economic value that was used by the Met Office. And I think Ed Steele will tell you a bit more about this this metric and how it was applied tomorrow. But as Alberto has already indicated, that actually it was the kind of practical value to the decision maker that was actually as important, or kind of more important in a number of cases. And again, you'll hear some good examples of that tomorrow. Okay, so here is my teaser, building the tension from Alberto, a table summarising some of the NL results using their performance indicator approach across their case studies and for different variants of different time periods, for different forecast lead times for different models. The only thing I want to say now is that a green tick is where the performance indicator has some value compared with climatology. And it's quite encouraging that there are more ticks than crosses, though, as you'll hear tomorrow, in some cases, the advantage over climatology is really rather low. But anyway, join us tomorrow to hear more about value add. And also we have a broader discussion next week, where we'll also bring in some perspectives from other European projects. Okay, but that was thinking about value from the perspective of the end user, and from the perspective of climate modelers, including our experts in seasonal forecast experts working in SECLI firm. They tend to think more about seasonal forecast quality using a number of different metrics. And this is a table of the metrics that you'll hear, and probably in the next session later today, you'll hear examples of these being applied. And well, in this, I know at times I still do it. I talk about skill and reliability of forecasts in a general way, and I tend to get told off by the seasonal forecast experts. I mean, it's confusing to them because you'll see from this table, they use these terms in very specific ways and have very specific and fairly complex metrics relating to these kind of terms. So these metrics are very helpful to the forecast kind of developers and those tailoring the forecast to understand the performance of the forecast, but can be quite difficult to communicate with users. And just to pick one example from SECLI firm, this CRPSS indicator here, the numbers that you get out actually go from -infinity for the worst forecast to I think 1 for the best forecast. So, but what was done in SECLI firm was to translate these numbers to this kind of qualitative description and kind of bands here, which are much more meaningful for the user. And I think you'll also see tomorrow that these were then converted to a color code scheme for the trial service. So I guess one of the messages is that skill is not, forecast skill is not the same as exactly as value to the user, though it's clearly forecast skill is a limiting factor. And here is another quick teaser of something that I think Ed will talk about more tomorrow from one of the case studies. But in this particular example, which relates to forecasts of offshore significant wave height, when you look at the Breyer skill score, so this sort of technical metric for forecast skill, the skill was kind of dropping off very rapidly within 10 days lead time, and after about 10 days was no better than climatology. But as you'll hear in more detail tomorrow, actually in some cases that there continued to be relative economic value out for 30 days. So indicating kind of more value, economic value to the user than you might anticipate just by looking at the forecast skill. Okay, and this is my kind of summary slide of COCO, sort of divided into the benefits, but also the barriers and challenges of taking this approach. So hopefully, as a result, we have better outputs and outcomes, some more credible, legitimate, salient products. These are words that you'll see quite often in the climate services literature. And And because it's a two-way process, hopefully the users have more trust in the providers, a greater sense of ownership of the final product, but also building capacity on the side of the providers, a better understanding of user needs. And ultimately, all of this will hopefully lead to higher technology readiness levels and help in the development of the climate services market. But there are kind of downsides in terms of co-production. One is the time that's kind of needed to do it well. The other is language. I gave the example of skill. I'm sure other people can give other examples where different communities use particular words in kind of different ways. Expectations. I mean, hopefully all our industrial partners, their expectations were met, though I know that perhaps they were disappointed to see the still relatively low skill of seasonal forecasts, but I think, as Alberto said, they stuck with us to the end. At times, there were issues about confidentiality and commercial sensitivity, but I think we've managed to handle that. And again, that's where trust on both sides is important. Well, one thing, I mean, we did have one or two economic experts, but I would perhaps for SECLI Firm 2, I would advocate kind of greater involvement of people from experts from social sciences, decision-making science and economic experts. So that was my conclusions. And the next slide